Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to get started in just a few minutes and give everyone a chance to log in. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to get started and I'll hand it off to ASH Executive Director, Laurent Hubert.
Thank you, Nichelle, and thank you to all of you for joining us today, and welcome to this webinar that we cover opportunities and trends to watch in tobacco control in 2022, and trends that could help us move towards a tobacco-free future. Today, you will hear about proactive litigation to advance tobacco control, advances around endgame policies, especially those that address the supply side when it comes to tobacco. So you hear about things that are happening around the world and interesting progress. And also you hear about how to use an environmental platform to advance tobacco control, but also you'll be warned about some potential pitfalls to watch and to prevent, and from a European perspective, and particularly a French perspective. The webinar today is co-hosted by ASH and the Comité National contre le Tabagisme in France. So again, we thank you for joining us today. Just some very quick housekeeping issues before we get started. You can ask questions using the Q&A icon, which is at the bottom of your desk, and you can feel free to direct them to a specific panelist, and we will make sure that they're addressed. If assuming there will be time, they will be then addressed during the panel discussion at the end. All of the slides will be linked, will be available to you in an email that you will be receiving after the event. And we encourage you to close other applications or browsers in order to have the required Zoom bandwidth to be able to see the webinar without any problems. So without any further ado, I will introduce the first panelist, and it's Kelsey Romeo Stupi, who's the managing attorney at ASH, and who will discuss and present proactive litigation to advance public health goals. Kelsey, please go ahead.
Hello, everybody. I'm here today to talk about proactive litigation. And what I mean by that is litigation where we're playing offense instead of defense, where we're not waiting to be sued, but we're choosing to initiate a lawsuit. So I just wanted to frame that first. Next slide, please. The first part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about some examples outside of tobacco control as things that the tobacco control community could consider as possibilities moving forward. Next slide, please. The first really interesting sort of case study on this is in environmental law. There's been a lot of proactive litigation in environmental law lately, particularly around the area of human rights. A lot of children's groups around the world have sued in various courts. There was one particularly successful one in Colombia where they challenged their governments because the children would not have the right to a healthy environment, to healthy water, and eventually to life because of climate change. So in that case, it was a group of people suing the government for their human rights, which was very interesting. There's also a group of seniors that have done it in Switzerland. So it's not always children, but the seniors also sued the government. And then there was one recent very important court case called Royal Dutch Shell, in which the Dutch courts gave a huge victory for climate change litigation, and it was a human rights claim against a corporation. 17,000 individuals and I think 17 NGOs sued for Royal Dutch Shell's actions on climate change. So that was an incredibly important one because, especially for us in tobacco control, because it was suing a corporation, not just a government. So that's a very interesting trend in international human rights law on proactive litigation that I think is really interesting and instructive for tobacco control. Next slide, please. Another set of lawsuits that have been really interesting to follow, particularly in the US, are around opioids, particularly Purdue. They were held guilty of fraud, and really interestingly, the judge overturned a settlement agreement that would protect the family from civil lawsuits. So the judge basically said, have at them, you know, they deserve it. So it's particularly interesting, again, because it's around a corporation and corporate actions. And I think sort of the tide is turning in the law on holding corporations accountable. And for us in tobacco control, that's really, really important. I think that the opioid litigation and other things like that are slightly less proactive, I would say, than the environment. Obviously, deaths occurred, and that's why people are suing. But I don't think proactive can't mean in response to something. Proactive just means we're being aggressive and on the offense instead of, as we often have for years, had the tobacco industry bring the lawsuit to us. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to move to some examples within tobacco control. Next slide, please. The first one is a recent case that I'm sure many of you have heard about. ASH and our partners at the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council, along with our partners at the American Medical Association and the National Medical Association, sued the FDA for their inaction on menthol cigarettes. And this resulted in a promise to promote a rule that is supposedly coming in April to ban menthol. So it's a really great example, I think, of proactive litigation. This lawsuit stemmed from a citizen's petition that had been submitted by the Public Health Law Center and many others years and years ago. And there was no response coming and no response coming. So instead of waiting, we decided to take offensive legal action and push the FDA that way. And so far, it seems to have worked. We won the first battle, not the war, so still to be seen. But I think at the very least, we lit a fire under the FDA with this lawsuit. So it's an exciting example of what could be possible with proactive litigation. Next slide, please. The next two things I'm going to talk about are actually criminal litigation. And this is a particularly exciting possibility and ties back into the opioid cases. The environmental law is largely framed in our human rights arguments. The opioid cases were criminal. The FDA case was not criminal, it was administrative and framed with some human rights arguments. And then these are two cases that are criminally focused. So that's an interesting distinction as well. I'm sure many of you have heard me talk about the case in the Netherlands before. The Sick of Smoking group brought criminal charges of fraud, manslaughter, and attempted murder. The victim was a young mother who had been battling lung cancer and unfortunately passed away during the proceedings. After several hearings in different courts, the appeals court determined, unfortunately, that this was an issue for the legislature. But this case was a huge victory in a lot of ways. It garnered a huge amount of press and attention, and there were over 30,000 people that signed on in support. There were several studies done, and this clearly changed public opinion around the tobacco industry in the Netherlands. So that's a huge potential victory for a case. Next slide, please. The next criminal case is in France, and we're lucky enough to have Emmanuel with us speaking today as well. So if there's any questions on this one, she's the person to ask. But a criminal case was also filed in France. Because of the legal structure in France, it goes to a judge first. One of our major goals in the criminal cases, I think, and in proactive litigation for tobacco control in general, is going to be to get over what we call the straight face test. We don't want someone to look at something and go, what? You can't do that. And I think that these two criminal cases have made it very clear that people are taking this seriously. We've passed the straight face test. So I think that that's a huge victory as well. And we will keep watching to see what happens in France. Next slide, please. I think another exciting avenue is human rights litigation. I mentioned the environmental law, and they use human rights arguments, but I'm referring here specifically to tobacco control human rights litigation. Most countries around the world have incorporated the right to health in their constitution, which means that when the right to health is being violated, there's an actionable court proceeding that can happen. So I think that that's a really exciting, very interesting possibility that tobacco control advocates should be doing more of. And we're seeing it some, but I think it could be much more widespread. And I also think that's an interesting way to elevate it within human rights systems. For example, in the European Court of Human Rights, if human rights litigation is started in a country in Europe, it could get into that court, which is where some of the environmental law has been happening. So I don't think it would be an unusual thing. Again, with the straight face test, I think that that court is familiar with these type of arguments more and more. So it's a great time to start using them in favor of tobacco control. Next slide, please. I do want to talk for a minute a little bit about the hurdles and pitfalls and potential unintended consequences. I think proactive litigation sounds really exciting, but there are definitely some concerns. I think the first one is time. Litigation is very time consuming. Many of you are familiar with the RICO case in the United States. It went on for over a decade. Things are slow. So this is not a solve it by tomorrow kind of solution. Another one is money. We all know the tobacco industry has a ton of money. Again, referring to the RICO case, they outspent the US government. So it's definitely a concern when taking on the tobacco industry that the litigation might just get too expensive. Another unintended consequence, I think, is sort of public opinion around litigation can be very sensitive. Sometimes it's great, as in the Netherlands case. I think that really painted the tobacco industry as villains. But I think in a lot of places around the world, people react very badly to what they view as frivolous litigation. So none of that is meant to discourage, just something to think about as we move forward into this new space, because I think it's very exciting, but there are some potential concerns as well. Next slide, please. Oh, I guess that's my last slide. So I just wanted to say again that I think this is a really important tool and a really interesting one. It's in the FCTC, Article 19 on litigation, and I think it's something that we should be encouraging more and more. I think that the precedent in different subject matter areas is really improved in the last couple of years, and now could be a very opportune time to start using some of these mechanisms to further tobacco control. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelsey. And I want to remind everyone to type your questions in the Q&A section. I have a few for you, Kelsey. And it's quite interesting. You mentioned Article 19, which is from a conversation we had recently with the WHO Secretariat. It sounds like countries, there's a bit of frustrations that we don't fully utilize that potential of litigation. I mean, we use it, but we could use it more from what we understand. Our next speaker is Chris Bostic, who's going to update us on various endgame initiatives that are really, really taking hold And things that seemed impossible a few years ago that are becoming a reality, really showing a path towards endgame and true commitment by local jurisdictions towards a tobacco-free future. Chris, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Laurent. So I'm going to talk a bit about where we're going to be going this year in 2022 on endgame, as Laurent said. And for those of you who were paying attention that long ago, this really feels like 2003, 2004. We're on the cusp of moving from something that is outright impossible to already in place. And I'm hoping that we'll have the same thing and we're falling over a cliff and get there. I also want to say I'm going to be talking about some of the big ripples in the pond, big stones hitting and causing ripples to go around. I'm aware of lots of little ripples that I'm not going to talk about today. And I'm sure there's lots of other little ripples that I'm not even aware of. So this is by no means a complete analysis of all the endgame talk and movement in the world. But first, let's go back to 2021 because that was a very good year for endgame. First, Beverly Hills became the first U.S. city to ban tobacco sales. They were actually tied with Manhattan Beach, but they get first because they passed their ordinance first. And then because Manhattan Beach did get mentioned in the first one, I will talk about the American Health Organization actually gave an award to Manhattan Beach and Beverly Hills for their tobacco sales bans. And then mid-year, Bloomington, Minnesota passed a law to end flavored cigarettes, flavored tobacco of all types. But in the same bill, they put a sunset clause in for their tobacco retail licensing. And by that, I mean they did not take away the licenses from existing venues, but they have they've said they will no longer give any new tobacco licenses and retail licenses, and they won't renew or transfer the ones that are there. So we don't know when, but at some point there will be no tobacco sales in Bloomington. And just a shout out to Dolgeville, New York, who also did this several years ago. It was sort of before the advent of endgame, so no one knew to call it that. And then probably the biggest one recently was the Time article about Brookline, Massachusetts. In July, the Massachusetts Attorney General gave permission for them to enact their tobacco-free generation law. That's a strange thing about the Massachusetts Constitution. The AG has to get involved. And so it came into effect immediately. And so in Brookline, no one born this century will ever be able to be sold tobacco legally. We're hoping that spreads rapidly. They are being sued by the tobacco industry, but the people in charge of legal defense feel pretty confident that they'll be able to get rid of that. Can I go to the next one? And one more. So let's go a little bit more international. We had a declaration from the Spanish coalition in May calling on their government to do something much more drastic about tobacco. It included a very detailed plan and a roadmap to getting to a low prevalence rate, and it culminated in a tobacco-free generation law in 2030. That is getting some support in the parliament, and so we're hoping that this year something bigger there will happen. And then perhaps the biggest shot heard around the world last year was the Ministry of Health's announcement of their policy plan to reach a tobacco-free world. You may remember that New Zealand had set a goal in 2010 to be less than 5% prevalence by 2025, and they're determined to meet that goal. And their endgame plan is fantastic because it includes almost everything in endgame. It includes banning the sale of filters. It includes a drastic reduction in the number of retailers. It includes reducing nicotine in cigarettes to non-addictive levels. And of course, just a phase out of sales altogether. We don't know which, if or all of these will be adopted by Parliament, but we're looking forward to seeing New Zealand setting a new standard for endgame in the world. And then we learned last year that the Canada had asked the FCTC secretary, that's the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, to add an agenda item to the Conference of the Parties, which was held in November. And that agenda item is Article 2.1. And even some of you who do a lot of treaty work might not remember 2.1. It's not a specific obligation in the treaty. What it does is it calls on governments to go further than the treaty, and basically explicitly gives them permission to do that. But the treaty is in no way a ceiling; it's only a floor. And so we're hopeful that that will take off in the FCTC. Because of the pandemic, COP9 was a truncated agenda, so they moved that agenda item to COP10. So that will be next year. And last World Cancer Day, so just about a year ago, President Macron of France announced a plan to drastically reduce the incidence of cancer in France. And in his speech, he pointed out that there's no way to do this without creating a tobacco-free generation. I don't think he was talking about specifically that policy of the capital TFG, but still, the recognition that they can't get there without doing some endgame on tobacco is helpful. And at the same time, the European Commission released its plan to drastically reduce tobacco throughout the European Union. And again, they pointed out that they can't get there without a tobacco-free generation. We'll go to the next one. So let's look at some momentum in 2022. South Pasadena, California is on the verge of passing a law similar to Manhattan Beach and Beverly Hills. It's going to be reviewed by the council, city council in early March, and our advocates on the ground seem to think that they will have unanimous support. So we can look forward to that third city in California and get the momentum rolling again, the momentum was really slowed down by the pandemic in 2020 because, of course, all city health departments had to focus all their attention on COVID. Next one. Right next door, Pasadena, California, which was on the verge of considering an endgame bill in 2022, is watching South Pasadena, and they're a little bit further behind, but we expect that by the end of the year, they'll be doing something on endgame. Next one. And then, of course, we broaden from there to the state of California itself. California has dedicated itself to ending the tobacco epidemic by 2035. And by that, I mean getting it down below 1.9% prevalence, which would be amazing. And they put some resources behind it. And so we know of at least, I think, 17 other jurisdictions in California that are going to be moving forward on endgame this year. No guarantees on how fast they can go or how many we'll have by the end of the year. But I don't think we're going to see the last of endgame in California with Pasadena. Next one. And then finally, there's some movement in Nevada. There is a state senator who's determined to ban the sale, or at least phase out the sale of combustible tobacco products in Nevada. It's getting some support in their Congress and amongst the coalitions there. Still early in the game, the Nevada legislature does not meet again until January of 2023. So we're planning way ahead. Next slide. All right, what we can look forward to in 2022. We're only about 6 weeks in, but we've already had some things happen. Because of New Zealand's plan becoming public, a lot of countries are now taking a fresh look at their tobacco control plans and where they want to be in a number of years. So we learned that 3 countries had decided, publicly announced, that they were going to be looking at New Zealand's proposal and determining how it might be implemented in their countries. The first one was Singapore, and you just click twice, Megan. Or Michelle. Then we learned that Malaysia plans to do the same thing, and we actually talked to some colleagues there who said that was probably unlikely. On the other hand, this is published by The Lancet, which is a pretty respectable journal, so we don't know quite what to think there, but even the conversation is helpful. Another click. And then finally, the health services, HSE, health services in Ireland decided they were going to also look at the New Zealand plan and see if they can ban the sale of cigarettes. So that is a huge movement. And then finally, we're looking to the planning for COP10 for the FCTC COP. We already know that there are several governments who are interested in working on endgame and a decision on Article 2.1. That would be amazing. As you know, sales were barely touched in the original FCTC, only as far as illicit trade and sales by minors. But now that it seems to be taken seriously at that global, again, government level. Next one. And then last, I want to talk about another path to endgame that has just sprung up recently, or at least re-sprung up recently. There have been a lot of attempts over the past 20 years to do something about cigarette filters. It's the world's #1 source of litter by weight and by number. And they've all failed so far, although some cities have passed a tax to at least collect resources to clean up this trash around the world. But now we're seeing a new movement on banning these things, banning disposable products. And California introduced a bill just last week that will ban the sale of cigarette filters and disposable e-cigarette packaging, which would be huge. We've also learned that several other countries are now interested in pursuing something like this. Now, obviously, this doesn't ban the sales of tobacco products, but it's hard to imagine many smokers continuing to smoke cigarettes if there's no filter. It's just become part of a cigarette to most people. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Laurent for our final.
Thank you, Chris. And indeed, this environmental approach, which is the one that our next speaker, Emmanuel Béguineau, the Comité National contre le Tabagisme will approach, is the topic of how to use environmental platforms, and specifically within the European context. She will present both the opportunities, but as well as the challenges we have to face. Emmanuel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be with you to present you the polluters pay principle here regarding tobacco industry and environment. And I would like to associate my colleague Claire Clément from Smoke Free Partnership. Next, please. First of all, I would like to recall how tobacco causes massive damages, of course, for health, but also because it's an obstacle for sustainable development, for household concerning a financial aspect, and for the whole society, if we see social cost, and here for environment. And we also know that the tobacco industry plays a key part in this epidemic and in the development of this epidemic, because it constantly is opposed to any efficient provision. And we have really a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between tobacco industry interest and the public health interest, and even the public general interest. So according to me, the principle of polluters payer should be included in any policy which try to tackle with this issue of tobacco. Next, please. Here on this slide, very briefly again, you see that the environmental damages due to tobacco and its industry are very important, from growing to waste, including deforestation, fire, and so on. Next, please. However, when we launched the first campaign in the 90s, I must admit that we really failed, and we were not really taken seriously. Next, please. And we, on the contrary, we had to face constant greenwashing public campaigns developed by the tobacco industry, which are still present nowadays. And all the tobacco makers propose such campaigns. Here you have an example with British American Tobacco. Next, please. But if you visit the website of GTI, it's the same. They include, of course, environment in their approach. Next, please. Here again with Imperial Brands. Next. And again with Philip Morris. And even Philip Morris uses this approach to promote its new products. So that way. Next, please. However, things are changing, and environment is really becoming part of tobacco control policies nowadays, and we have different indicators which prove that. First of all, we have really an increase of publication on scientific researches concerning the link between tobacco and environmental damages. And if you see the comparison between the 80s and the publication articles published between 2010 and 2019, you see really the difference, even if globally we have an increase concerning environment, but here it only concerns the relationship again between tobacco and its damages for environment. And as a consequence, we have a better media coverage on that topic. And the approach has become larger and is not limited to the growing, and also include an analysis of the responsibility of the tobacco industry. And that's a symbol if the next World Tobacco Day will be focused on that topic. Next, please. So The principal polluter payer developed here at the European level and transposed in France belongs to this global trend and evolution. It is, however, an innovative initiative. It refers to a European directive developed and adopted in 2019. That's the SUP directive, which has been transposed in France. And this directive aims at reducing the impact of plastic in the environment. And that means that it concerns not only tobacco products, it also concerns, for example, plastic bottles, food containers, but also tobacco products, especially filters, which have plastic filters for cigarettes, but also filters used for cigars, for your own tobacco, and even heat-not-burn tobacco. And the aim is to reduce the number of discarded cigarettes, but by 40% by 2027. And there are different provisions, including obligation to develop information regarding tobacco and environment through campaign, and also through positive obligation. Here I mean through the obligation to oppose warning to inform consumer regarding the link between tobacco and damages for environment. There is also an obligation for the tobacco industry to make reports regularly concerning the results about the decrease of cigarette butts which have been thrown. And so it enables us to make comparison over time and also between EU member states. And the key element in this polluters payer principle is that it is we have what we call the extending producer responsibility. That means that tobacco industry has to pay for the cost of cleaning up cigarette and other tobacco product butts, and that the tobacco industry has to pay also for city facilities, or also for the HoReCa sector facilities, such as free provision of street ashtrays, for example. And the tobacco industry has also to contribute financially for research projects concerning that topic. Next, please. Next. Thank you. However, this system has some weaknesses I would like to develop, because it's important to keep in mind these weaknesses, because even if it's really a very good initiative, we have to be careful concerning some of this problem. First of all, these weaknesses are we can explain them because of a very strong lobby that has been developed during negotiation, and because of a strong interference of the tobacco industry during this negotiation. And the second aspect is especially that the extending producer responsibility system has not been adapted to include particularities regarding the tobacco industry and the enforcement of Article 5.3 of the FCTC. That means that the tobacco industry involvement goes far beyond what is strictly necessary. For example, in France, we have an ecosystem which has been created, that gathering all the tobacco makers, producers, and also its allies. The name is ALCOM. And it is in charge of, for example, of organizing this campaign for information. And of course, as you can imagine, the responsibility of the tobacco industry is not at all pointed in the current communication. And if you visit their website, the website of ALCOM, on the contrary, you will see that they always transfer the responsibility to the smokers only. And besides this, there is also a risk of moral laundering, because the tobacco makers could appear responsible in a positive way. And it's not at all the situation. They were strongly opposed to this provision at the beginning. The second aspect, which is problematic, is that there are some provisions which could be counterproductive. I mentioned in my previous slides that the tobacco industry is supposed to give away individual ashtrays for the HoReCa sector. And we know in the literature, scientific literature, that it is counterproductive to give ashtray because it will lead to an increase of the consumption. And so as a consequence to increase the second aspect is that if local public authorities want to have their bill paid by the tobacco industry for the cleaning, they have to conclude an agreement with the ecosystem ALCOM. That means that they have to contract an agreement indirectly with the tobacco industry. And beyond that, you can imagine that if they develop relationship with these local public authorities, it could be really problematic, especially for tobacco control. The third aspect is that the system has a quite limited scope and effective provisions have not been taken into account. And we know that we should implement other tobacco control provision to reduce the consumption and so to reduce public plastic waste. For example, if you extend tobacco-free places, you reduce the consumption and this waste. And we even didn't discuss the possibility to prohibit, to ban filters to reduce bats. And there is also other damages caused by tobacco products, which are not covered by this disposal. Next, please. Thank you. So if we try to see which lesson can be taken from this experience, on which recommendation we could mention, first, it's important to insist that it's for sure an excellent initiative to introduce the polluter pays principle in the environment field. That's a good idea because it's important that the tobacco industry pays instead of local authorities or taxpayers. And it also contributes to the implementation and to contribute to reach SDG objectives. And the fact that the tobacco industry was strongly opposed to this measure is probably a very good sign. However, there is really a need to raise awareness of the FCTC and the obligation of Article 5.3 among public environmental authorities, because they even don't know the FCTC treaty, and their attitude towards the tobacco industry is the same with any other industry. The second element is to define a governance structure of this ecosystem, including only stakeholders who will be independent directly and indirectly from the tobacco industry and its allies. And we recommend also to adopt a larger approach regarding environmental damages due to tobacco and its industry, and also to adopt a larger scope of measures, including, of course, tobacco control provisions. And probably the best way to cover this approach would be to create a tax paid by the tobacco industry, which would finance this ecosystem. So to conclude, I would like to say that's really a very good initiative, but which absolutely needs to be amended and extended. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. This is actually fascinating. So we're going to have an opportunity for Q&A. So again, I encourage you to write your questions in the Q&A section. I have already a few questions, and before I start with the questions, if I could ask one of my colleagues to also give the mic to Janet Hoke from New Zealand, from Professor Hoke, Dr. Janet Hoke, given that she's from New Zealand, and she will have an opportunity to comment a little bit on what's happening in New Zealand, given that it's such an amazing progress towards endgame. So the first question that I have, so I want to just go straight to your presentation, Emmanuel, in terms of the challenge, and with this on the ground, the folks who work on environmental protection, for example, are unaware about the FCTC, about the tobacco treaty, and also not that aware of the negative role it plays and how it undermines public health policy in general, but also it will use any platform to basically use that as a platform for corporate social responsibility and to whitewash its image. So what would be the very practical things that could be done? So you mentioned the tax at the onset by the industry, which I agree, and I believe California, in San Francisco, there's an example of that. But what else, what could we be done? Because one of the challenges we have is outside of health, often people are not even aware of the tobacco treaty. So do you think, would it make sense to try to strengthen the link between this UN treaty on tobacco with for example, environmental treaties? Would that be an approach that would work to try to find a way to better communicate the link between those various treaties to advocates at country level?
Yes, the first thing really is very important to disseminate the FCTC treaty, to explain what is this treaty and specific provision regarding this treaty. And because if you take into account from the beginning all the principles and the guidelines which have been defined, then the organization for the principal polluter payer will be organized as a consequence. And especially the key element is, of course, the inclusion of the tobacco producers in the system. That's really the problem here, because they are in the ecosystem. And of course, even if we have some garde-fous, for example, in France, it's prohibited to have CSR communication. So what they're going to communicate will be checked. However, there is still a risk, and there is anyway a risk that they won't communicate on their own responsibility, as I mentioned. And the second element is the problem that they have agreement with local authorities. And so that way they can develop their lobby and so on. That's why we for sure we have to include at the very beginning the FCTC treaty, and so that these rules be included in the elaboration. And that's why probably I mentioned that the tax would be easier, because it's a justification, for example, for earmarking tax for tobacco control funds, for example.
Yeah, very interesting points. And indeed, it's so important that as a public health community fully utilize those processes, because as you pointed out, the industry has been using it, and they take advantage of those processes if we're not absent. So it's really for us to be well prepared for this fight. And before I go to and give the floor to Janet and go back to the topic of Endgame, I want to continue on the topic now on litigation. And that's a question for both you, for Kelsey and Emmanuel, given that both of you have been involved in litigation and both criminal cases. What do you think is the main obstacle to a criminal case at this stage, to moving it all the way through? Is it because it seems like one thing that it's interesting, and I've heard you say, Kelsey, I think it was like a few years ago, you brought in legal experts on corporations and criminal liability, where, if I remember correctly, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, they were doubtful. After strong legal analysis between legal scholars, they said, oh yeah, there is something there, but still we haven't seen a successful case. What is the biggest obstacle? Is it lack of political will from prosecutors? In the New Zealand case, it was the fact that it was legal. But can you talk to us a little bit, what are the obstacles and what are the opportunities that we should basically actually overcome, or the opportunities that we should maybe take advantage of, the challenges we should overcome and potential opportunities? And it's a question that I like for both Kelsey first and then Emmanuel to follow back on.
Sure. So I think that's unfortunately a really complicated question. It depends a lot on where we're talking about. I think political will is a huge barrier. In the United States, you need a prosecutor to bring this case. An individual can't do it. So the government has to decide to take on the tobacco industry. And that's a big ask. But I think from sort of a legal, more conceptual perspective, I think the issue is often that we don't have a law that directly relates to this. There's a case that I talk about a lot, the peanut butter case. A corporation was producing tainted food. They knew they were producing tainted food. They killed about 10, 12 people, and they went to jail for an incredibly long time. But it was under the Food and Product Safety Act that they were charged. So I think in the US, it's often challenging because it's just under the criminal code because we don't have an overarching law. So that could be solved in other places. And I know in the Netherlands, they tried. They brought it under a public health code. So Emmanuel, you might have some thoughts on that too.
Well, I can only speak for the French situation. Difficulty is for us that we are allowed to launch legal action, and we launch quite many legal actions, but it's only in the framework of the public health code. And if we try to launch a legal action outside this scope, it's very difficult for us, according at the present time, to prove that we have a direct damage. And that's why, for example, for the case you mentioned, we have to find another way to launch again this action. That's the main difficulty we have concerning this kind of action.
And I also want to highlight, I don't think anything I said is prohibitive. I think that we can get around it. It just requires a little creative lawyering and a lot of political will.
And would you be comfortable also speaking a little bit, a question that comes up very often from the general public is even, why don't we have an international court case, criminal court case, for example? Why, given that, you know, it's so well established, so many people are killed because of the behaviors of the tobacco industry, they're really the poster child of corporate malfeasance. Is this something you feel comfortable? I know you've been involved in that. I know you talked to prosecutors.
I'm laughing because this is absolutely a pet project of mine, and I absolutely think it should be. I think that the tobacco industry has met all of the definition of crimes against humanity, and I think that the International Criminal Court should be taking jurisdiction here. One way to get into the International Criminal Court is that we need cases from other countries that courts have refused to move forward on. So the Netherlands could be the first in a series of cases we need to go to the International Criminal Court. So I think that's a long game strategy, but I think it's very possible.
Emmanuel, do you have anything to add to that? Or
yes, for sure, it's would be an excellent initiative. Just now, what we can already propose is to share decision, because most of the time, what the tobacco industry use as arguments in a country is very similar with arguments used in another country. That's already something that can be shared.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to quickly switch back to Endgame, and I would like to give the floor to Janet, Professor Janet Ho, given the amazing advances that we see in New Zealand and the plan being put forward. And what I understand is the fair amount of support within the government for this plan. Janet, the floor is yours. We'd love to hear your input.
Look, thank you so much, Laurent, and thank you to all of the speakers as well. It's very early in the morning in New Zealand, and it was definitely worth getting up to hear this great seminar. Look, thank you for the opportunity to comment on what's happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand. As Chris gave a wonderful overview, so we have an action plan. It's got 3 key elements in the action plan. That's a substantial reduction in the number of retail outlets. So going from the current, which is about 6,000 to 8,000, down to simply a couple of hundred. So that will be a really major step in reducing the accessibility of tobacco. The other second key plank of our platform is reducing the nicotine content in tobacco products down to minimal or non-addictive levels. And then the third plank is the introduction of a smoke-free generation. So they're the 3 core elements of our plan. And then, of course, we have many other components to it as well. And a number of those have been covered off by Emmanuel. So we've got some provisions to remove filters from cigarettes, to reduce the appeal and the palatability of tobacco products by removing key ingredients. I'm very happy to send a link to our action plan, but just to pick up on a comment that Chris said, at the moment, our understanding is that the measures set out in the action plan has strong cross-party support. So that means that when they do come into the Parliament later this year, we're hopeful that they will all be passed in their entirety. There's only one small right-wing political party that's expressed its opposition to the action plan. Now, of course, the proof is always in the pudding. We need the politicians to act on their word, and consistency is not always the forte of politicians, but we are very hopeful that the plan will move quickly through Parliament and that these key measures will be preserved. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. So you bring up an interesting point that reminds me about well, so it sounds like there's so much political support, and it's wonderful to see this emerging from New Zealand. And it reminds me a little bit of what we used to hear around smoke-free after it was implemented, when talking or communicating with some of the health ministers or politicians involved. Almost every time, and that was at the time when this was unpopular, almost every time they would say, I wish I'd done it sooner or earlier. They actually then, it sounded like then they felt that actually was actually very politically popular to work on tobacco control policies. So to some extent, I think maybe the public is way more advanced than sometimes even our own public health community. And Chris, if you could maybe talk about that a little bit, because I know, Chris, you've been on top, you've been looking at all the data collection sets that are taking place around the world. And some of them are about public perception. And it sounds like the public is way, way above of where we are. We saw yesterday the one, well, we know that the French data came public, where almost nearly, was it 87% of the French population supports a tobacco-free France by 2030. So Chris, could you expand a little bit on that? Chris, are you muted, or did we?
Well, I'm just back. I got kicked off, but if you can repeat the question.
So I'll repeat the question because I think it's an important one. The question is that it often seems like the general public is way more advanced than even the public health community or politicians. And in the context of smoke-free policies, after they were implemented, we start seeing the first public health policies coming into place in the very early 2000s, that when they were asked about it, most politicians said, I wish I'd done it sooner, because they're not realized the level of public support for it. And from the data collection sets that I know you're monitoring that are taking place all over the world, there's a fair amount of support from the general public for those type of policies. So could you expand on that? Because I know you're looking at a lot of research out there, a lot of data sets, which are really suggesting that the public has actually an appetite for those endgame policies.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been a little bit blown away by the results that we've been getting and other people have been getting on their surveys. Typically between 70 and 80%, and sometimes more than that, respondents are in favor of ending the tobacco epidemic. Even if we're very specific about the question of banning sales, we get tremendous support. And one national poll that Ash did, we broke it down by non-smoker and people who smoke, and no matter how we ask the question, at least half of people who smoke are in favor of doing it, because most of them want to quit and they know that this could help them. I think there's two sort of problems with why this doesn't resonate. One is that politicians care about what their voters think, but I don't think they're convinced that this is how they vote. That even though there's a high support for it, it's not the thing that makes them pull that lever. And if we can convince people that this is important and make politicians know that, I think it will. And then the other thing is, it's new, and people don't want to stick their neck out, at least most people. So far, we've been dealing with communities who don't mind being in the forefront. And of course, we always need those people. But soon it will become normalized, and I think we'll see a flood.
So I'd be curious to hear, because Emmanuel, you know about the French survey, which suggesting like over 86% of French population. I know in Spain, our colleague who's also listening to the webinar from No Fumadores, Raquel, they conducted a survey where also like that, even among smokers, no one wanted to see, for example, the kids started smoking. And Emmanuel, if you want to comment quickly.
Yes, I agree that when you have polls, usually people, non-smokers and even smokers, support this kind of measure. However, the problem, and we also have similar results when we, for example, we work at local level, at the level of a city, and we have we ask people in Hamilton, if they agree to, for example, to adopt this smoking ban here, they agree. But if you have still a high prevalence in a country, that's the case in France, people also have a contradiction. And when we have to implement really this measure, you also have, after that, an opposition developed against the measure. And that's why it's very important to take that into account. If you have a very important prevalence in a country, it's really something problematic to impose something.
Yeah.
Even
Yeah,
if people, of course, even smokers do not want the children smoke and so on.
Absolutely. You bring a very, very good point. So there's a big difference between, for example, France or Spain, which have high prevalence rates, versus, for example, Panama, a country where there's a prevalence rates of about 6%, where it would be, much more easy politically to move forward with that. So that makes a tremendous amount of sense. There's one question that came up, which is an interesting trend that we're seeing happening. And so the last question before then I ask you for your concluding comments from the speakers. But it's a question on the increase in synthetic tobacco products, which basically often do not then fall within some regulatory framework. In some cases, in some countries, they're not regulated as a tobacco product, and that can, in some cases, creating problems. So I don't know if you have any of the speakers can speak on that topic, and also maybe in the context of the FCTC. My understanding is the FCTC is meant to steal, and even synthetic nicotine is supposedly falls under the jurisdiction of the FCTC. But I'd like to hear your views on that. Any of the speakers on that?
I can comment on it from a liability perspective. I think it just really complicates things more. I think for a criminal case in particular, it's really nice to be able to prove, I mean, the ideal person, the ideal victim would have smoked the same type of cigarette their whole life until they developed lung cancer and then passed away. And I think adding in complicated, less regulated things is going to make any litigation strategy a lot more difficult. Caroline, I couldn't tell if you were asking what countries, like which countries. I don't know the answer to that, which countries have more synthetic nicotine than others. I don't know if other people do.
I certainly don't.
I'm conscious of time, so we only 4 minutes. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to give the three speakers and also Janet, because I'd like to give them the New Zealand experience. So if we could have the three speakers in the order in which you spoke. So Kelsey first, followed by Chris, Emmanuel, and then Janet, to just your perspectives in 1 minute, 2 max, your views on trends and things to watch in 2022.
I think that the one word I would use is intersections. I think all of these things are going to come together, and that's how we're going to have the most effective tobacco control this year. I think we'll see tobacco and human rights together. We'll see tobacco, human rights, and the environment together. All of those things lead to endgame. So I think all of the things we've talked about today intersecting is going to be the most effective tobacco control in 2022 and beyond.
Chris?
Great. I'm going to turn my camera on in the hopes I don't get kicked. I would say just one thing, a call to action from the audience. And the number one barrier that we're finding in Endgame and in Project Sunset is people don't know it's possible. And even when we started talking about this a few years ago, even our own colleagues, a lot of the reactions were, can you do that? Is that legal? So the more we spread this, the better it's going to be. People just we know they want to if they're asked, but the ones we haven't asked don't know it's possible. So talk.
Thank you, Chris. Emmanuel?
Well, I would say very important to disseminate the notion of Article 5.3 because it's a key element to adopt new provisions and also to enlarge the topic so that we can work with other partners. And also to continue to have action against the tobacco industry in order to continue to have decision so that we can impose them to pay for their cost and also to get punitive damages.
Exactly, absolutely. Hold them responsible for the harm they cause. And I just want to point out for those who are not familiar with the Article 5.3, those who do not work as much internationally, and for the US audience that's not as aware of it, this is the article basically that makes it in the tobacco treaty, that makes it very clear that the tobacco industry shall not interfere in public health policy. Janet, if we could get your views also on what to watch for key trends for 22, given your very unique perspective in a leadership country.
Well, thank you, Laurent. I think that probably the key word will be domino. And I think that picks up on what Chris was saying, that we are now imagining things that we've never imagined before. And I think that that's really going to catalyse global action. Other countries will see that it's possible. We all learn from each other. And I think we're going to see the catalysis of policy action throughout 2022 as we see what's done elsewhere, recognise it can be done in our own countries and start to implement it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank all of the panelists and Janet also for joining us last minute like this and really willing to speak. Please do follow us and we will have we have webinars on a regular basis. The next one would be on a topic that links to this, is on the environmental laws of vehicle for protection from secondhand smoke. As you know, there is interesting concepts and ideas coming up there's some from Israel, also in Spain in the context of, extending, maintaining smoke-free outdoor places in the context of COVID. Are there potential opportunities for legal action? And so on and so forth. So there can be quite a few opportunities. Also, I invite you all to continue looking at the tools for advocates on the topic of human rights and tobacco, which does lean obviously on the right to a healthy environment, given that it does, and Kelsey mentioned a little bit the topic of human rights litigation, which is one I think is also probably worth its own webinar through maybe at sometime in the year to bring human rights lawyers who can maybe advise the tobacco control community on how to use that to advance litigation. But on this note, I'm conscious of time. We're right on the. We try to start on time and end on time with our webinars. So again, thank you very much for joining us. And our next one is, I believe, on March 10th. So please join us for that. And thank you very much again, and continue your amazing fight for health. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.